today we're doing a presentation, Tech for Good, Digital Services and Refugee Integration Loan. I'm just going to give just a very short introduction from myself. I'm Alex Swann, I'm a software developer, and we're going to just talk about who's going to be speaking during this presentation. We have Charlotte Moore, who's a senior user researcher at the Home Office, and Georgina Hall, who's a lead quality assurance tester, as well as myself. We all work at the Home Office and we have combined experience across government, including at the Ministry of Justice's Apply for Legal Aid team, Police Digital Services and Her Majesty's Passport Office. Refugee Integration Loan was built by the Home Office Form Support team, and we will be going into more detail about it in just a moment. Today's talk will sort of start off with Charlotte talking about user research on, you'll hear us use the term RIL. It's just a short acronym for Refugee Integration Loan, what it is and the decision that we made to put it as a form online. Quality assurance testing with Georgina and why it matters to us. And then the majority of the presentation, which will be done by myself, where I'll walk through the tools we used available to us to build the form, including sort of various technical detail, but hopefully not too much. So non-technical people in the audience, it is accessible to them. So passing over to Charlotte, she will now talk about user research into the project.
Hi, thanks, Alex. Thanks for the introduction. So I'm going to give you a nod when I need you to change my slides, if that's all right.
I might not be able to see that.
You might not be able to do it.
Yeah, I might, but no, I might not be able to see it, so you might just have to say next, sorry. So I've got it full screen.
Okay, brilliant. So if you could go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So just as an introduction for my team, I work in the Home Office Policy and Innovation team, and we are a multidisciplinary group of people. We are technologists, service designers, and user researchers, and we work very closely with policy teams to identify problem areas. We then do research with users and anyone that's sort of involved in the problem space, and then we can generate new ideas. We test those ideas, we make sure that we have confidence in them, and then hopefully we have a more likely to be successful solution that we work with. So we were engaged by the Refugee, Asylum Support and Integration team in the Home Office, and we were asked to look at the Refugee Integration Loan. If you could pass on to the next slide, Alex. So just to give you a bit of a rundown about what exactly the Refugee Integration Loan is, it's an interest-free loan which is from the Home Office to recent refugees. So when they get leave to remain to stay in the country, we offer favourable repayment terms. So we allow people to pay back that loan over the course of 5 years or however long they have left on their leave to remain. And it's intended to be used to sort of help them with the setup costs once they're sort of setting up life in the UK. So things like housing and things for their house, or maybe education, training, things that might help them find work. So the Home Office funds it, and then we work with DWP, who administers the payments, and then they also work on the collections of the payments, largely through universal credit, although when people are in private employment, they negotiate with people on a repayment plan. And so the loan started in 2007. And in that time, we've helped nearly 19,000 refugees. This date was of November 2019. And we've managed to recycle that initial investment that we made into the loan, but we've made sure that we have paid out nearly £10 million to refugees over this time to sort of help them with their life in the UK. Next slide, please. So when we started looking at the Refugee Integration Loan, we knew that it hadn't really been looked at since 2007. We knew that it was only a paper form, so a largely paper-based form process. And the cabinets that you can see in the background are actually the operations team's sort of backlog. That was their caseload there. Not many changes have been made because it was kind of self-sustaining. Not many people were looking at it or paying attention to the loan. There was anecdotal evidence that there were issues for the applicants, perhaps that the loan could be doing more for them, and that there were also issues that the operations teams were having, but these were really not very well understood. And against that backdrop, we knew that there was a growing demand for the loan because there were more refugees coming to the UK. So we thought this was a prime opportunity to look at the problem. Thanks, Alex. So we undertook a period of research where we spoke to support workers and refugees, and we were able to identify some key issues. The biggest issue for the refugee user was that it was a 14-page paper form in English language, which was difficult for them to complete independently, and quite often that they were having to seek help with that through support workers or charities in the local area or friends and family. We also identified that some of the lending criteria wasn't being published. So some people were applying and then they weren't successful in their application, or they were asking for more money than we would be able to pay for them. And also that the loan was taking far too long to reach the refugee. So there was a backlog when we started working on this project, and it was taking up to 5 weeks from the application to the money being paid to the refugee. So I'll go into these in some more detail. So yeah, we identified the avoidable barriers for refugees to access the loan. So as I mentioned, people weren't able to fill out the application form on their own, but they were also not being made aware of the loan. So it was going in their initial pack when they were getting their status to stay in the country, but there's a lot of information in that pack. So the loan information was getting lost in there. There were some other issues that we identified in the paper form. We were asking for a lot of information, but actually we already held that information. So we should be being a bit more smart with that and not asking people to provide all of that information to us. It was the English language was posing problems, and the fact that they were having to go and seek help to do it was delaying the whole process and putting people off applying. So next slide. Then the flip side of this is we mentioned that the paper form wasn't great for refugees. It also wasn't great for the operational team. So it was prone to error, things to do with handwriting not being understood or fields being missed out, information being confused or lost, and actually the operations team, the admin team, were having to enter information into our own digital systems once they were receiving the paper form. So really not ideal. And also the fact that we weren't really benefiting from learning about who was applying for the loan, where they were, and what they were using the loan for. So we were missing a lot of insight there. Next slide, please. So we honed in on the things that we wanted to try and work on, and we wanted to improve. So we wanted to answer the question of how might we make it easier for refugees to understand the form and how to apply independently without help from others. How might we ensure that that financial support is provided quickly and when needed, so at that critical time when they need to access housing, and how we might be able to improve and help them get more adequate housing. So the housing that they were getting wasn't always furnished, and so how could we help them make themselves a home? So through our findings, we tested with prototypes, we tested with support workers and with refugees, and we learned that the online application was easier to complete. This was for a number of reasons. It simplified the process. A lot of people felt like the form was shorter. In some cases, it was shorter because we were only asking questions that we needed to ask based on the information they'd given us. But also it was the way that we were presenting information to people. So it was just one question on a screen at the time. We worked with content designers. We made sure that our language was much more simplified. And because it was a digital application, when we were testing it with refugees, we saw a lot of people copying from the form into Google Translate and checking what they were doing. And that, again, enabled them to do it independently. So the fact it was a digital form was really helpful. So we're really pleased that the loan form went live in September of this year. We've been looking at the stats over the last couple of days. In October, 68% of all of the loan applications came via the online form. We're getting lots of positive feedback about people finding it easier, support workers too. And in November, at this stage, we're looking at 86% of the loan applications that come in so far are on the online form. So it really seems to be taken up. We've got a survey that we're putting out to people, and we're getting some feedback already, which is saying that people are receiving the money within 2 weeks. Over 52% of people are receiving the money within 2 weeks, and 47% of people feel that they are getting the money sooner than they'd hoped. So this is all like moving things in a positive direction. So now that's a bit of background, and I'm going to pass over to Georgina to talk about the quality assurance process. Is Georgina there? Here she comes.
I should be there now, hopefully. Yeah, good. Thank you, Charlotte. That was really great. I enjoyed that. So I've got a 5-minute whistle-stop tour to talk about how we approach testing within this area. So on the back of what Charlotte said, her testing is slightly different in that she's trying to draw out the requirements, basically, of what the users need. So quality assurance kind of feeds on from that, as well as working into the development process, whereby we take that information and we actually make sure the application is going to work in the way that we hope it works, as well as considering all the other factors that we would need to consider. And that is the users ultimately get the best experience when they use it. So a tiny bit of background about us. So I work in QAT, which is quality assurance and testing. That's quite a large department within the Home Office, and we spread out pretty much everywhere with all the software that's developed and applications that we use, both within the Home Office and also anything we create that needs to be used by the public, including refugee integration loans form. So really 5 minutes whistle-stop tour. So I'm not going to be able to go into great detail about everything we did because we spent quite a number of months testing and working on this product. But one thing I want to impress on you as a group really is the main success we achieved is as a team is testing and quality is considered from the very start, and it's in everything that we do. So it's definitely a team effort, and even though we're quality assurance and testers, we certainly work with everybody in the team to drive out that quality in what we do. So even this is a good example. I get to talk to you before development, so we work very well together to work in that manner. It's certainly in our mindsets. Alex, could I have the next slide, please? Great. So again, impressing this point, testing really does start from the very start, and everybody is responsible for that testing and in turn the quality of what we do. So also to talk about a bit more about testing is that isn't just the front end. Yes, that's the main point. That's the main touch point of where your users reach the application. They're ultimately interacting with what we have produced, be this or on a web form. But there's also a lot that goes behind that. So we cover a wide range of areas such as non-functional testing, operational acceptance testing, security, accessibility. The list is long. And it's really important to consider all of those things, as I said, from the very start. So going back to the user as well, we consider the user not just necessarily the end user, and in this case we have refugees who are filling out a form. We also consider who else is using the form, so it's us as a support team. So we have to think about things like operational acceptance testing, whereby should the back end fall over, the connection to the database drops, what happens? What do we do? What can we put in place to support that? So we might have alerts, we might have a fallback, we might have processes clearly written somewhere that we know to look at when something goes wrong. So that's the what happens if scenarios. The other things, obviously, we consider from a user perspective, is it accessible? Does it work on all browsers and devices? We consider that entire scope. So really as a team, we achieve that because everything we do every day, we're reminding ourselves of all of these factors. What happens if, and can the user use it? And are we considering it from the very start? Okay, so can I have the next slide, please, Alex? So yeah, this is very short again, so this is my last slide. But really, why do we care that testing starts from the start. Well, not doing it does cost. Not only does it cost in time to fix, let's say you found a big problem right towards the end when you're about to go live, and that live date may not be able to move. Ultimately, you know, the product suffers, you suffer, and the users suffer in the quality of what we've delivered, because you might find, for example, that you just have run out of time, so you have to go live with something that's not quite right. And I would always say, consider that scenario. Think to yourselves, is that something really you could have addressed earlier, or something you could have thought about earlier that helps you in the long term effectively? So yeah, the cost, yes, monetary cost and development cost time right towards the end, but also ultimately the users do get affected, and the quality of your product does get affected by that. So yeah, as I said, it's a lot harder, costly and time consuming to fix issues towards the end. So for example, if you had to replumb a bathroom, or if you had to make something accessible after it's been finished, it's a lot harder to fix. So yeah, hopefully those key messages have come through, and what we do at the Home Office is we think about it from the very start, and it's considered throughout. Yeah, and that's me. Right, so over to Alex now to talk about all good things development.
All good things. No, I'm sure. I'm just going to give a couple of seconds pause, waiting for my mug to come up on the screen for everyone. Sorry, I've got this PowerPoint full screen for me, so I can't see anything else. Brilliant. All right, we're going to talk about the software development on refugee integration loan. I'm going to just initially talk about the application itself, and then I'm going to talk about sort of our pipeline and automated deployment sort of further down the line. So initial development, that was done by the CoLab team. I won't go into too much detail about them, but they essentially created the prototype, and this was handed over to us at the Home Office Forms support team, which is a part of something called Shared Application Services at the Home Office, where we sort of want to take these products that have been built in the past and add to them, but where they're sort of supported and built in-house, rather than, you know, a team that's full of contractors. They may go away, that you sort of leave that knowledge when they go elsewhere. And so far, I think it's going very successfully. CoLab themselves looked at utilizing pre-existing products around to set up RIL, rather than build another service from scratch. They used an in-house built framework called Home Office Forms. We'll also go into that into a little bit of detail. And they use GovNotify, which is a government digital services supported service, which is used for email and text notifications, as well as paper sent out in the mail. If you want to have a look at that, there should be some links in the slide deck if you would like them. Home Office Forms support team. These are other services that we currently support: Appeal Rights Exhausted, BRP, which is Biometric Residency Permit, amongst others, as well as firearms licensing and report online terrorist material. So there's quite a few. I think at the moment, including refugee integration loan, that's about 9 or 10 services we support, and all of them are node applications that extend off the same framework, Home Office Forms, which also outside of our team is used in other areas of the Home Office, including Border Force, Registered Traveller Service, and Life Event Verification in Her Majesty's Passport Office. Interesting fact, Home Office Forms was initially, its genesis, as you were, it was created as a framework that is now to this day still being used by the online passport renewal service for anyone who's had an out-of-date passport recently. That was sort of where sort of HOF came from, but it was then forked to be, I would say, a simpler framework for more lightweight forms than the online passport service. So that's sort of how it came to be, as you will. Home Office Forms itself is open sourced. It is on GitHub. Feel free to peruse if you would like. Links at the bottom of this slide. And this project's been around for about, I say circa 6 years. It must be now. I started the Home Office in 2016, and I think it was already a year or two old then. And yes, it was initially developed by contractors at the Home Office, built using Node and Express. Since then, I think it was split out into about 32 repositories, and I think there might have been an idea about how to make it extendable and everything, but it became an absolute, it became troublesome to manage, so we say. So we've now consolidated it into the run repo, which has made it a lot easier to make updates, security updates, fixes, that kind of thing, and to manage the ecosystem better, as well as having an example application we can use to make changes to the framework without needing to then publish it to NPM registry and bring that into a project to extend off. As the framework has built-in components and validation logic, that makes form building much faster. Rather than having to create a new service from scratch, it has a lot of sort of reusable logic, as you were, which I can talk about in a moment, which means you're not having to keep repeating yourself in each service we support. Also, the sort of front-end UI that's based on the Government Digital Service Design System, which you can see an image there on the right, which is over here. Essentially, we kind of use that into some way, bootstrap the styling and everything. And here's just an example, I think, of refugee integration loan over here doing a similar thing. So we're just going to go into the little bit of technicals now. I tried being sort of wary of, well, not wary is a good term, just being mindful of who might be in the audience. I thought, yes, it is a Hacker Job event. There probably will be a fair number of technical people, but I thought if I could create some snapshots where it's still accessible at a high level, that would be nice. So looking at the framework, here is an example of sort of how we, in some ways, configure our routing. So yeah, let's just get into it. So this is just an example of sort of our routes file, let's say, of the service that extends off that framework. We sort of have a steps kind of section here, and that sort of dictates the URIs that the user would move page by page through the form. So for instance, all our keys here are strings, prefix or /, reference number, BRP, and essentially if a user was to go onto the first page of, let's say, this service, they would hit the domain name, and then the first URI would be obviously reference number. All the keys along here, including, which obviously JavaScript, you can use variables, set up each one of those sort of links, which one links the other as you continue and move through the form. The nice thing about HOF, or Home Office Forms, I keep saying HOF, but I don't want to use acronyms because we're really naughty for that. But the great thing about Home Office Forms is if a user decided, let's say they'd already completed this journey once, they needed to come back to this form at another point in time. Let's say they cached in the URL or they manually typed it in and they tried to come into this point over here. Each step which precedes every other step within this object acts as a prerequisite to another. So in other words, if someone visited contact and in their session data, sessions persist the data throughout the form temporarily on Redis, and it sort of went, oh, they haven't visited these steps yet, it actually redirects user back to the first step or the last step that they completed. So if they got this far up until sort of BRP, and then suddenly they try to jump to complete acceptance, it would send them back to the contact page, which is really nice because I think I've worked at the Ministry of Justice and they've got an amazing service there called Apply for Legal Aid, but it is built in Ruby on Rails, and they need some rather enormous state machine to manage this kind of process, and pretty much 99.99% of the time it works really well for that kind of state management as you go through the form. With this sort of, I'll just clean this up a bit so it's not too, there you go, very nice. As you can see with the other fields, these will act as keywords. Fields, essentially any string or array of strings you put into fields, they act as the ID for the input field or radio buttons field that, again, it sort of falls into the framework and allows that quick setup of fields you want. And then next here is sort of the next step to move on to after this. And we can also have forks in here as well. So if someone, if you've got two selections you can make on a radio button and it moves either to one step or another step that has a totally different sort of path. So if you think of it as a tree with sort of roots that spread out, if you can go back and change your answer, and then the state changes every proceeding links from that, and then they can continue down a different path without confusing the session or the framework, which is great. We also have behaviors in the framework, and if you think of it in these terms, that's where we can put in customized controller and model logic. As you can see here, we're sort of, if I grab the highlighter, if we, within the sort of behaviors for each one of those routes or steps, as you were, we extend off the superclass, and the superclass is the kind of inbuilt framework behaviors that get called as part of the sort of get and post lifecycle. So let's say I'm a user, I load up the page. There's certain sort of keyword functions like get values, locals, that kind of thing, just before the page loads that get run. And then when the user submits the form and posts a request, there's save value, success handler, that kind of thing. So within our behaviors, it means we can just keep additional business logic to that specific step without having to rewrite a load of extra stuff that needs to be there on almost every step, and that's all inbuilt into the framework. If I wrote just a randomly named function here, it wouldn't get called, but success handler, we override the default success handler function in the sort of parent class, as you will, and then we call that super.success handler here to continue on with the process. And in the interim, in this example, you can see we've got an upload PDF sort of model we're instantiating, putting some data into there and essentially uploading before we continue. So it can be very nice. Sometimes it can be a little bit convoluted, and we're always trying to find ways to streamline things even more without it being so sort of opaque to new developers. So we're always trying to improve our documentation, which admittedly does need improvement. And that's because the team's only really taken over from the framework in the last 12 months. And then with our fields file, you saw back in our routing, we specify these as strings here, right? So what are those doing? I think, okay, yeah, you specify them as fields, and let's say we've got a BRP number input field that's just going to have an idea of that. So what? Well, we also have a fields sort of section, and the keys in here also link up to the array of strings or whatever, you know, in the roots file. And then here we can specify using keywords that the framework looks to pick up, like validate or formatter. So in this example, we just pass in what a string required. What does that do? Well, hopefully it should be obvious. If the BRP number field is on the page and the user doesn't input anything, we have a nice default sort of validator called required for dealing with that, which then raises a validation error saying, hey, you need to input something. As well as that, we can add slightly more customized validations, like you know, a BRP number regex up here, so it follows the BRP number format. And even like date of birth, we can check that it's after 1900 and that they're over 18 and it's not in the future. So it just means you can actually build very similar or identical components to what we have in our other services really quickly, which is nice. And even like using formatters, so it can transform the data that's entered without you needing to, again, add further logic into the controller or behavior. Our translations files are all sort of JSON objects. And again, they're JSON files even, and they link up to the fields similar to the fields does with the roots. And this, again, allows us to set up hint and label text. So it's quick to update content and see that live on the page as you're doing development work. What's also nice about the framework, which I haven't had much experience with yet, but I think they might have done it Registered Traveller, is you can configure it so you can set it up to be multilingual or accommodate multiple languages. So I think if someone is coming from a public IP address that's maybe from France, then the website could all be in French. And also, I think there have been other examples where it's given the user a choice what language the site should be in, which is probably even more helpful than just where the computer is. Yeah, so any further information on the Home Office Forms framework, we do have a static GitHub IO page. Again, it could do with a bit more improving, and that is on our roadmap. Just to keep adding to it, because there's lots of nooks and crannies that the original developers who put this together probably didn't have the time, because they were probably moving quite quickly to document everything. So as we're discovering new things about it, we're also seeing where there might have been gaps in how they implemented certain things, seeing if we can refactor them and document them better. So we're just going to quick talk about the pipeline now, which hopefully is interesting to everyone. So we'll just cover automated testing. So what tests do we have? So you can see here, I have a nice example of the steps we run when we've merged to master. Yeah, you can see here, there's a load of things that happen, but basically I've tried to set something up where it's sort of continuous deployment all the way to staging. And this sort of follows I think a similar kind of pattern, as you were, set up is probably better, that they have at the Ministry of Justice, which is where when you open up a pull request on your repository, it sets up a like-for-like clone of all your resources in UAT. So I'll talk about that in a moment. Yeah, automated testing, we've got linting checks with ESLint. We've also got unit tests with Mocha Chai, Sign for Starbig, and Proxacquire. Integration, and that's more sort of for the controller behavior sort of model logic. That's sort of what we try to use a unit test for. Linting, because we've got 10 services, we've tried to set up our own configuration, which is sort of a bit based on Google and I think Facebook setup, I'm trying to remember off the top of my head, but essentially so that the code base and the style of it is consistent across the 10 of our services, because what we don't want is an apprentice or an intern or junior developer who suddenly comes to the team, they look at one service and then they look at another one, they look entirely different because there's lots of white space all over the place, dangling commas, there's no consistency, so that it's harder for them to then penetrate maybe the code because it looks the format is completely different to the next thing. So you get what I mean. We have integration tests that we try to use to check all the routing throughout the application, and we also use it to check the validation content, because it's just, some people do and don't like to check content. Validation messages probably a bit, we feel is probably more of a priority to get right than hint text, even though hint text is still tested. Mainly so the user knows if they have done something, what they've done wrong, and for them to get the right message and try and get through the service first time without finding hopefully any pain points. And that's really quick. I think it takes a minute to run rather than some acceptance test that can take several minutes to run. So we try not to sort of overburden automated testing all at the sort of acceptance test layer and think about where might be the appropriate place to put those tests to not just stick all in UI tests essentially. And then we use Cucumber and Playwright for acceptance tests for UI, and that's usually if there's a bit more kind of interaction UI logic that's harder to do with something like our integration test with Supertest, where that kind of spins up a kind of headless process in a sort of enclosed space for the Express app to run in. And then we have accessibility tests as well with Pally, but I think we're also looking to explore Axanax Cucumber potentially, which is good because it means our team members in QAT don't need to constantly try and do manual tests every time they're going checking new piece of work. So by having more of this, it really does help them as well. And we're always trying to think about that before we start a new piece of work. GitHub Actions. Oh yeah, so this is interesting. So I believe this GitHub Actions are fairly new, maybe earlier on this year, or maybe it's my ignorance, maybe they're older than that. But at the frameworks level, so on our Hoff repo, we rather than trying to set up, we use Drone at the Home Office for our sort of pipeline stuff as well. But for the framework, because we tend to need to publish an npm module of it, which then gets used as a dependency in our projects, and that's all the sort of drone IO stuff happens. At the moment, to ensure we're kind of constantly patch or minor or major tagging the repository and at least setting up a default release note, which admittedly at the moment, because it's an automated process using GitHub Actions, doesn't contain anything. But I think for if we're doing tagging major versions, I think we would like maybe to actually have some helpful information release notes so that others using the framework will understand what are the major changes. So far, it's been a lot of minor and patch fixes since we've picked this up this year, but we're constantly working to improve on this. So what I like about GitHub Actions is rather than needing a big drone file or using Circle CI or something like that, it is just a couple of small YAML scripts in the project where every time you open up a pull request, you can see here it kind of does a sort of matrix check. So this checks node versions 10 to 14 against Redis versions 4 to 6. And there's a fair number of unit tests in the framework. So it just kind of gives you just like, yes, all these tests have run successfully, but also just as importantly, they've run on slightly older, newer versions of Node in case those services want to not all be migrated to the same version of Node at the same time. I appreciate there are later versions than 14, but again, these are things that we're trying to move and progress and upgrade things gradually, because I think there was, with the Home Office Forms framework, it hadn't been maybe maintained so well in the past, but now we've got a team focused on it full time. We're looking to increase the ability to keep updating faster and faster, and not let things get sort of too deprecated, as you were. At the moment, also, we're using Git commit messages and a minor and major tagging, so we can automate the sort of tagging process. I think if you don't put anything like that, it just assumes it's a patch fix. Otherwise, it'll auto tag it as minor and major, and then also release an npm module to the npm registry for us. So it just removes all that kind of manual. Okay, I need to manually tag this. I need to then push the tags to the repo. I then need to run npm publish. We got a new person. They need access to the npm registry to do that. So it makes that a lot more fluid. And of course, it could be better, but it's still early days for us, and there's always improvement to be made. For our service deployment, so we've got something called the Application Container Platform, which is a platform managed by the Home Office. We have the shared responsibility model, is that right? Where they're sort of in charge of the sort of maintenance and support of the Kubernetes cluster that we deploy, make our deployments to. Whereas we need to be mindful of how we set up our Docker images, security around that, and obviously need to set up the sort of drone pipeline steps ourselves. We use drone for running our tests, which you saw in the previous shot I've showed you, and for automating the process of building a Docker images, which, if you've got a slow machine and a bad internet connection, trying to do manually is a real chore. So I sometimes, even for just doing lightweight test work, try and use the drone pipeline to do it, because it's going to be faster than my machine. We build, at least for refugee integration loan, build and deploy Docker images to AWS ECR that is also managed by the Application Container Platform team. I'll say ACP because it is a bit of a mouthful, but just so you know what I'm talking about. That they have they've automated a way of deploying Docker images to Elastic Container Registry, which is what this is. But when we open source it, the UK Home Office Digital has its own kind of namespace, as you were, on Key.io, which is where we'll sort of move to. Within the Docker files themselves, we've definitely improved, I think, what we're doing before, which is specifying like Node Alpine versions, just like version this or version that, because when I sort of look through it and try to audit it and trying to be mindful of what might be best practice, now we try and suffix the version with the digest, which is better to stop people maybe tampering with versions you are using to prevent supply chain attacks. We also don't run our Docker images as root. We create a sort of a group and a user as an integer within the Docker image, and then change ownership of all the files to that, so that there are no files that have been owned, as you were, by root. Which is super user, if no one knows what I'm talking about. And also we use Anchor, which is a sort of security scanner, which sort of raises any potential security vulnerabilities in the base image. So we also ensure to try and update those as part of this process. Using drone, for those who are not so familiar with drone, it's kind of syntactically similar, I think, to Helm if you've used maybe Circle CI. So it's quite similar. And to be honest, some drone isn't amazingly documented. So by looking at examples using Helm, actually, there's certain things discovered which has made mine, probably other people's lives, a little bit easier. At the top of our drone file, set up a sort of environmental variables for our namespaces, our main production URL, where our Docker images are stored, because a lot of that information tends to be referenced, not all the time, but most in more than one place, not just in our drone file, but in our Kube deployment files as well. And I'll show you an example of that in the next slide. But also, we've sort of implemented in a drone file anchors, which is this. So let's say I wanted to run unit tests after I deploy to our branch environment, because at that moment, my priority is getting a new piece of work into our test environment to have a look with it, have a look around and play with it, even if all the tests might not be passing yet. So I don't want to always, if I have to keep changing things, fix all my tests first before then checking it in a test environment. So with that, I want my unit test to run after it's deployed to our test environment. However, when I've merged to master, I want all of our tests to run first before it then deploys to a UAT environment. So with that, it's like, okay, well, that means that I want sort of 2 unit test steps, but where the majority of the step configuration is the same, other than maybe the event that calls it. So Angus is quite nice to slot in sort of reusable configuration, as you were, into multiple places in your drone pipeline. So it kind of keeps it a bit more dry, and I quite like that. In our sort of Kube resources, here you can start seeing, so, you know, we've got @name. If I go back, that's this thing. There's certain environmental variables I see not just used to drive, you know, the ingress name or anything like that. So for instance, here we've got our different environments: branch, UAT, and production. And rather than having like multiple ingress files or multiple deployment files, it's quite nice to use the sort of conditional logic that I think is similar to Helm, to have it all in one place. So you can have just one ingress file for branch, UAT, stage, and production, rather than 4 separate ones. And the same kind of thing here. We have a sort of bash script that uses KD is just an extension of kubectl CLI tool for deploying into different namespaces. But you have it all in one place. I think before, this was possibly about 4 times as long and in 4 different places. So it just keeps everything a lot more consolidated and dry, which is really nice. Service deployments. Oh yes, and another sort of special thing to mention is I think previously all of our Kube resources were stuck into GitLab or a private repo in GitHub. And it's this kind of like, oh yeah, well, anything deployment-wise or ops-wise, let's just stick it in a private layer. So that didn't make much sense to me, and made actually triggering deployment, like using events, triggering deployments a little bit more complicated. So I was like, well, if anything is should be a secret, it should be a secret, right? Fine. But also, let's be mindful of, if we make open source all of, you know, the majority of our Kube resources, is there anything in there that might not be a secret but be deemed sensitive? So maybe ingress annotations, or, you know, Nginx settings here for your Nginx reverse proxy. So we've got that kind of configuration in a private repo, and we inject it into our files so that any kind of sensitive configuration is still in the private kind of space, but the majority of the sort of setup for our Kube deployment files, service files, network policies, which is fairly standard generic setup, doesn't have to be in that private layer. So it means we've got a better focus of what is private, rather than just sort of going, oh, let's just bung a load of stuff in there, not really think about it. And sort of lastly, on the sort of pipeline stuff, we have security checks as well. We use Snike and Anchor, which we run on pull request. So if we're doing active deployment, it'll let us know, oh, there has been a change, there has been a new vulnerability that's picked up as you're doing this active development on this pull request. Otherwise, if there's not ongoing support work going on a project because it's been a couple of weeks, we have weekly cron jobs that alert us to if an update is needed. And then this is just, I'm not expecting people to penetrate this now, a sort of architectural map of sort of what I've been talking about earlier. So in a nutshell, I'll just change it to green so you can see it. We open up a pull request on our projects, and it runs our tests and sets up a like-for-like environment as our sort of UAT environment over here. This means we can do full end-to-end testing, not just like what you might run locally. You can check, you know, your Nginx reverse proxy settings. You can check your ingress settings, something that's quite hard, if not maybe impossible for some to be able to do just on their local machine. And it means you can get a real sense for how maybe hardened a new feature might be. Also, if other people are using different machines, you can use an external or an internal ingress. For those who don't know what that means, it's external means anyone in the public can access it, but we can whitelist certain devices to access it on an external ingress, or an internal one if they've got maybe a Mac rather than a government issued POIS device. Then they can just use the ACP VPN. So it means you can collaborate with a few people on not just a new piece of work, but a whole new feature. So you can have other pull requests that come into this feature branch and get everything tested, signed off, and approved before we even have to merge to master, which I think is working a lot better for us, because before there were a lot of cases where people would be merging stuff to master, crossing their fingers, hope it works. It would break UAT, and then it would prevent other people from being able to maybe merge a content change and get that deployed to production, which should be quick and simple. So that is really nice. And when they do merge to master, this whole environment gets torn down, and there's a weekly cron job to clean up sort of test branch environments in case someone changes the state of something and that gets missed when there is a merge to master. And then all the tests and everything, it gets run and deployed straight to staging. And to be honest, at this point, it is a manual deployment to production, but it should be a formality because everything that needs to be done should be done at this point, but before it even gets merged, which is great. So just last sort of section for real, going live. There was a few pre-live improvements. I think we had a HTML to PDF converter, so we'd have an HTML template we convert into PDF file that we send to caseworkers. The responsibility of that was also in the refugee integration loan service, and it was a bit flaky, and there was sort of unexpected behavior. So I discovered this, which I put a link on down here, which is a microservice that was already built and already running in production for another team. I believe it was Animal Life Sciences, which works really well. So I spun that up as its own kind of sort of took it out of our service, had its own sort of API, and used that, and it was actually a lot faster as well. So that was great to see. And then final checks, we just had to coordinate with the government digital service about ensuring we're using the correct appropriate domain names, which I think service.gov.uk, and updating the main government gov.uk website to point to our service. And yes, and we also set up Google Analytics so we can actually get an idea of how many people are doing single or joint applications, how many offers being accepted, and also any sort of pain points in the service. What's the top abandoned pages other than the first page and last page? Someone might start and go, oh, I don't have the thing, so they come back and try again later, or if they've gotten to the end, they might leave their computer or screen open so before moving onto another site. So that's why that might be an exit page. So there's lots of things to discover there, including the fact we've set up cross-domain tracking with the GDS, which is if someone moves from one government site to our site to another government site, it's anonymous. There's no PII in the logs. It just gives the GDS an idea of how people are using government services, their movements among it. But if they go to somewhere that isn't a government domain, obviously the buck stops there. They don't keep tracking that anonymous user. So we're trying to come up with better sort of data sharing tools and techniques across government, which is good. Future improvements. We have test coverage at 80%. It could be better. I think on the Apply for Legal 18, they had 100% test coverage for their project, so it is achievable. At the moment, our Cucumber tests are a little bit given when, then, and we'd like them maybe to be more BDD, behavioral-driven development. We'd need to probably set up something to bootstrap a session so you can jump to different points in the form without compromising how it manages state of the user as they move through it. Automated security testing, that would be good. I know there's been a lot of talk about whether we could automate sort of OWASP threat test tools that could run periodically. Automated load and performance testing, that also would be quite nice to see. A lot of our services don't have a huge number of people using it per year, but there's certain new services might be onboarding where we would expect a greater number of traffic. They are sort of protected against anything like DDoS attacks, but obviously if loads of people overburdening say at the same time and we haven't set it up or to scale up that way, then those are things for us to think about. We've also had several professions missing in our team, but we've actually got a business analyst in the last week or two, so someone who can talk to our stakeholders and confirm sort of any additional validation or hardening that's needed by the team, as well as a user research designer would be nice, so we can get a bit more of a kind of agile sort of feedback loop, which they'd obviously would talk to users, and that would sort of drive what work to prioritize next. We're talking to our stakeholders more. We want to do more show and tells. We want to demo to them. The feedback we've had in recent weeks has been really positive, and we want to utilize that greater with our other services. And of itself, it is using the GDS design kit, but it is a few years old, and that's sort of next on our sort of roadmap, as you were, to improve. Lastly, this has been the user feedback on refugee integration loan. I think we've had about 125 submitted applications, and about 25% of them have been really, really positive. I mean, it's been great that we're capturing that, so you know, miraculously reliable was one that did give me a chuckle, I have to say. Whether or not it's actually users specific themselves, because I think we're talking to Charlotte, that the English maybe here was probably better than we might have anticipated. It maybe caseworkers might be filling in feedback for them, but it's definitely the user's own email addresses where they've chosen to insert it, so we know where it's come from. And this is sort of what we've been trying to achieve by digitizing the service, making it easier than the paper paperwork for the loan. That's exactly what we wanted from this. So it's good that without any prompting, someone has said that in the feedback where they didn't have to. But it's not all perfect. Someone's mentioned it'll be easy. It'll be better if there were other languages as well. And that was something that Charlotte mentioned earlier on. The English and the content on our site is probably a lot better than the form. I haven't seen the form myself, but it certainly sounds like it is. We try to use clear, concise, short language. But if we need to accommodate other languages too, the framework can do that. But then we'd need probably to do some user research into establishing, if we were to accommodate other languages, what languages would bring the most value. Maybe there's a common parlance or a native tongue spoken by the majority of people who use the service, but what happens if there's a major event in current affairs which then affects the number of people who've coming to use this? So maybe before events that happened in Afghanistan, there might have been, Afghan might have not been the main language you might think you might want to incorporate into the service, but maybe now it is. So there's lots of things to think about there, and it'll be interesting to see how the service progress. And just to open up the forum now to Georgina and Charlotte. I mean, personal thoughts about the service for us. We thought it'd be a good thing to mention right at the end. We care a lot about our services. Actually, sometimes probably too much. I've worked 5 years in government, and if you said, "Oh, I'm just building a form," most people would probably like, "Oh, that sounds very interesting." but for me, sort of trying to get to grips with sort of the actual code base, the back end, front end, and support a product that actually is really helping people in need. I don't know if Charlotte wanted to chip in, but from the user research she'd done, but where there's people who are using paper forms, for instance, that is the process in which to submit that and have it processed is a real blocker for them getting the help that they need, they deserve, and they shouldn't have to wait for that. So for me, it's great to at least be providing support and building a service like this where we've actually even gotten that feedback right at the end in such a short space of time.
Yeah.
So
thanks, Alex. Yeah, I was just going to chip in there and just say that we're really pleased, having sort of done this first-hand research, met a lot of the people that were struggling and had conversations with them about their experiences and wanting to make things better for people in the future. We were so pleased to have managed to get this live, and particularly at this time, as Alex mentioned, with increased numbers of people coming through the Afghanistan resettlement scheme. So we're glad that we've got these things lined up now.